Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Okay, so we're each going to say something about what we believe first, before we start talking about why we believe it, or why you might believe it. Excuse me. Hope you'll excuse me. I'm kind of messed up. But so we'll just take each of us like 5 minutes to say, okay, this is what I believe. And of course, this isn't all we believe, but we'll just throw some characteristic things out there. So I grew up in a very religious family, and I'm not saying that out of, like they were too religious or something. It was fine. But we went to church 3 times a week. We prayed about everything. We expected God to be doing stuff in our lives, and there's a lot of things there's a number of things that I was taught as a kid that were part of my faith then that I don't believe anymore. But there's a lot more of it that I do still believe. And there are some experiences that I had, that friends of mine had when I was young, that I don't think were really experiences of God, that I think were mistakes we were making. On the other hand, there's lots of experiences that I had when I was younger, which I still do think were experiences, in some sense, of God, and that they were veridical, which is what philosophers say when they mean they revealed truth. So I haven't fallen too far from the tree, so to speak, and I have a skeptical attitude towards some things from my religious past, but mostly not. So what are some of these things that I believe? I believe that this world, this universe, and we ourselves were created by an all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly kind and benevolent and good being. And this being brought everything else into existence. And this being couldn't have failed to exist. I believe that, a lot of people believe that. A lot of religions affirm that. I also think Jesus was a real person, that Jesus' life and his teachings, maybe I'll move this a little bit, his life and teachings accurately or adequately reflect God's heart towards us. And I take it that he claimed to represent God's attitude towards us, and that Jesus was a part of a rescue operation on God's part, sent to save us from a terrible situation that we're in. And that Christ's death and resurrection, those were key moves in this strategy. And that the Holy Spirit is at work, can be palpably present to people, helping us and making God's presence real to us. Now, because of the picture of evangelicals or fundamentalists that you get from television, which is sort of like the picture of Jersey people that you get from Jersey Shore, right? It's only the loudest, most obnoxious, most attention-grabbing people who show up. Many of them are about as Christian as the people on Jersey Shore. I think it's important to say some of the things I don't believe, because you might think that, he believes that stuff, he's going to believe this other stuff. So I don't think that the Earth is 10,000 years old. I think it's incredibly old. Right? I don't think that evolution didn't occur, macroevolution. I think it did occur. I don't deny that we and apes have common ancestors. Many Christians do, and I understand why some of them have some of the skepticism they do. And I think that some of that skepticism is well motivated, but I don't see it. All right, so and I don't have a problem with it. I suspect, I wonder whether maybe 100,000 years ago there was an Adam and Eve or a small tribe or something that was in some sense raised to rationality. That's Peter Van Inwagen's term. That something happened there that was miraculous and that marks, it explains why we are so different morally and intellectually from anything else, any other animals. But I'm not going to go to the stake for that. Although I believe Christ's teaching, Christ's life, death, resurrection, that's all crucial to God's plan, I don't think that people who never heard about that are headed straight to hell. So if God really loves everyone, God's got a plan, and it's a bigger plan than a lot of people make out. So that's all I'm going to say.
All right. It's very easy for me to say what I believe on these topics because it doesn't come to very much. I don't believe in invisible people who run the universe. I don't believe in the gods of Greece and Rome, Zeus and Athena and Aphrodite, and you don't either. People used to believe in those guys, even though hardly anyone had seen them or heard from them. Still, they believed that there were dozens of invisible deities who occasionally meddled in human affairs. But we all know now that they were wrong. I assume no one in this room believes in those guys. Everyone in this room believes, in fact, I would say knows, that the religion of ancient Greece and the religion of ancient Rome were mythologies. So my line is that all religion is like that. I know that lots of people, lots of very smart people, lots of people I respect and admire, believe in a single God, just one of them, but still an invisible one who in some way or another made the universe, runs the universe, takes an interest in the universe, but whom hardly anyone has ever seen or heard, though they may get indirect glimmers every now and then. I think these people are mistaken. I think the monotheistic religions that we know about are like the religions of Greece and Rome, mythology. You can ask me why I believe this, and I'll tell you more about why I believe it later, but I should say something, as my colleague did, about how I came to believe it, and that's a slightly different story. So my parents were scientists. I was raised to believe that religion was this mythology. People used to take that stuff seriously, but we've outgrown it since we've learned more about how the world works. I don't think I knew a seriously religious person until I got to graduate school. I had known some observant Jews, but it never occurred to me that they actually believed in that stuff. As far as I knew, they didn't actually understand the words they were saying. They were into it for the ritual. But it never occurred to me that they might actually believe in an invisible spirit who ran the world. If you want to get a feel for the kind of atheism that I find perfectly natural, just remind yourself how you think about the religions of ancient Greece and Rome. Right? You know that stuff is just a mistake. The attitude that I had naturally as a result of how I was raised towards all religion is exactly like that. Now, as I say, I know that lots of people take the monotheistic religions and some others very seriously, and I still find that a little shocking. And that's part of the reason I'm interested in discussions like this, because I'm trying to get a better sense of where the rest of the world is coming from. Look, suppose you discovered tomorrow that in some pocket of New Brunswick, there are still these people sacrificing oxen to Zeus. That would be a little surprising. I don't think it would tempt you to wonder whether maybe those guys have got it right after all. What you think is, God, those old stories have hung on a lot longer than I thought they had. That's how it was for me when I finally started. My wife and her family were the first religious people I ever met and got to know well, and I was pretty old by the time that happened. And it was strange. It was like, I suppose I had read in books in the newspaper that there were people like this, but I had never met anyone. It was a bit surprising for me to find that there were still large numbers of people who were in the grip of what I took to be a myth. And I find this puzzling. But it's not just that I find this puzzling. I actually find it a little bit disturbing. And so this is just me confessing how the spectacle of serious religion strikes me. When I think of all these people in churches and synagogues and mosques pouring their hearts out to an invisible being whom none of them has ever really seen or heard, organizing their lives around devotion to this thing, I do sometimes wonder if I've stumbled into, through the looking glass or into some kind of madhouse. It strikes me as bizarre. I understand the psychological need to believe that death isn't the end, to believe that justice will somehow be done, to believe that all of this somehow makes sense. But to believe in an invisible person who runs the world just because one hopes for these things, that's wishful thinking. And wishful thinking is irrational. So I find myself struck by the spectacle of hundreds of millions, billions of smart, reflective people, many of whom know as much about science and everything else as I do, who nonetheless spend a significant chunk of their lives doing this, who orient their lives around devotion to an invisible being, and I find that disturbing. I find it disturbing for another reason that I'll just mention very briefly now, and then we'll talk much more about it as we go on. So as I understand them, the monotheistic religions worship a God who is supposed to be omniscient and omnipotent. Dean described his own views in this way. The creator of the universe, a God for whom nothing is impossible. And this means that they worship a God who, as they see it, stands by and does nothing as millions of children die slowly and painfully of cancer every year. In fact, since they believe that this God whom they worship made the world, established the causal order in which this suffering plays out, there's a sense in which they're worshiping a being who, as they see it, kills millions of children slowly and painfully every year by establishing a causal order in which, as he knew from the very beginning, it would play out so that these children died horrible deaths. He could easily have done things differently. He could easily prevent these deaths. He's omnipotent, after all. He made the universe. He can prevent these deaths, and yet he doesn't. Some people take all of this to be an argument against the existence of God. That's not how I'm spinning it now. What I find disturbing about religious practice of this sort and religious belief of this sort is that it involves people whom I know are decent, thoughtful, reflective, morally upright people, loving, worshiping, organizing their lives around a being whom, as they believe, permits or maybe even causes horrible, horrible things when he could easily prevent them. And I don't know what to make of that. I find that spectacle dizzying. A God who does that sort of thing might very well be a fiend. If a human being could easily prevent millions of deaths every year, slow, painful deaths of the innocent, and chose not to do it, you wouldn't love him. You'd think, I have no idea why this guy's doing what he's doing, but for all I know, he is a fiend. And someone who organized his life around trust, love, and devotion directed towards someone like that would be mystifying to you, I think, if it were a human being who was being elevated in this way. From where I sit, this kind of religious devotion doesn't look like the sort of faith one can admire. It looks like, as it now strikes me, some kind of perversion. Human beings have a capacity for love and trust. And somehow this natural capacity for love and trust that we have winds up directed at a being who, as the believers think, does awful, awful things. I want to know how to understand what my relation should be to people for whom that is the organizing fact of their lives, devotion to a being who does those things. And I've been thinking about this, not as seriously as Professor Zimmerman has, but I've been thinking about this on and off for a while, and I still don't understand it. The objection here is not that there's no evidence for the existence of God, or that it's not even that religious belief is irrational. The objection is that religious belief is morally unintelligible, indefensible. Morally indefensible because it involves extending love and trust where the facts leave no room for morally defensible love and trust. So I'm sorry, that was a little more strident than I had meant it to be, but that's how it comes out sometimes. So the big question for me about religion is not really whether God exists. I'm really pretty confident in the answer to that question. And it's not really whether religious belief is rational or reasonable, though I do think that's an interesting philosophical question. The hard question for me is whether religious belief is morally defensible. I'll leave it there.
Okay. So I was going to say something about why I believe the stuff I believe, but maybe I'll kind of segue. Maybe I'll take a little more than 15 minutes and segue into responses to the problem of evil, because that's one of the things that's on the table. So first of all, there's a certain kind of reason or a reason for believing in God that I don't have. I don't have the kind of knockdown argument for the existence of God that involves premises that I can give you, and any reasonable person will see that they're true. And there's principles of evidence that any reasonable person will accept. And the conclusion is God exists. I don't have that kind of argument. So, sorry. Next, let's go home now. No, it's not so depressing as all that. I've got a couple of reasons that I believe in God, and probably a whole bunch, really, when you come right down to it. Some of them do appeal to public evidence, that is, the sort of things that anybody can observe. But they make use of principles of evidence, that not everybody will accept. And then I've got some other reasons to believe in God that involve religious experience, and this is experience that I know not everybody has. Not even everyone who would like to have it. So the second kind is also something that I can't sort of just give to anybody who wants it, although I can suggest that you might try to get some of it. The first, let me just say something about that first kind of argument. You might think it's too bad if you've got an argument that appeals to some evidence and then it makes use of principles that not everybody accepts. Or it says, look at this evidence, doesn't it seem to you that what this supports is blah? And some people look at it and go, no, it doesn't. And others look at it and go, yes, it does. This doesn't make me feel as bad as it would otherwise, because everybody does this all the time. And we take people seriously who do it. So especially in philosophy, my goodness, we can't be throwing stones at people who understand one another's arguments and yet disagree in the end, because there are principles that they think are kind of obviously true, but they can't get the other person to see them. And all they can do is sort of keep articulating them or just showing examples of them. And that happens in philosophy. It happens in lots of places. And, in every one of your departments, wherever your major is, there are no doubt professors in your department who have deep disagreements about what appear anyway to be factual matters. They disagree about things. One person thinks something is true, another person thinks something else is true. Think about politics. Not even an academic subject, not even politics as an academic subject, but politics as practical views about which political systems will have the best results. Well, people disagree radically, and they have arguments, but you get down to seeing things to be so or not at various points. in the case, one case, cases often come up at the boundaries of a discipline, where you're the discipline is sort of pushing forward, and there isn't a consensus on something. Nevertheless, people have strong opinions. So in quantum mechanics, there's different interpretations of what quantum mechanics is all about. The kind of orthodox view says observations collapse the wave function, whatever that means exactly. But there are superposed states, and then they go away. There's interpretations that say, now there's never any collapse of anything. Particles aren't superposed. They all have precise positions. This is the Bohmian view. Everett's theory says every time you think there's superposed states, there's actually different worlds, and they're real, just as real as the one that you're observing right now. And I know people who hold all of these views, and I know that they think that the people who hold the alternative views, some of them anyway, think that the people who hold the alternative views are just flying in the face of reason. Okay, now maybe they're all being totally irrational, but I think some of them are right about some of the others, that some of those views are better than others. Nevertheless, there are principles about the simplicity of the theories. Some people emphasize that more, sort of the fruitfulness of it, the craziness of many worlds. Some people just find that that's enough to knock the view out right there. And a bunch of people think, no, so we didn't think that initially, but it's, that seems to be where the evidence is going. And so anyway, you have disagreements of this kind, and there are arguments involved, but you get people assessing the evidence in different ways, and it's because of commitment to different principles about how to assess the evidence. Now, the arguments of this sort that religious people give for the existence of God are many and varied. There's, I think Plantinga once listed 48 or something like that. And someone's trying to come up with a book in which all 48 of these are defended. Now, I don't think all 48 are. I was actually asked to defend one of them, and I said no. That argument is not defensible. So some of these are much, much better than others. None of them are irresistible. I'm just going to talk briefly about one. I like, one, it's really a kind of a combo. I kind of like cosmological arguments. I kind of like fine-tuning arguments. What are these? Well, so cosmological arguments start out with some kind of principle about things needing an explanation. So contingent things have causes that are sufficient to explain their existence. Even if the causes don't necessitate the existence of something, there's stuff that's happening that explains how this thing came to be. For any contingent thing. And contingent things are just things that didn't have to exist. Now, the Big Bang seems to leave us with an unexplained contingent thing, namely the whole universe. And if you think that that's all there is, well, then if you like this principle, you think that a necessary thing must have caused it. Now, not everybody likes the principle. Okay? But a lot of people do. A lot of people think it sounds true. If it really is a truth, and a deeply true truth, well, then those people may well be latching onto it in the way that philosophers hope to latch on to necessary truths when they're doing metaphysics or ethics or whatever. There's a bunch of things you could say about that. I'm going to stop there. Fine-tuning, I think the two can sort of be put together. Fine-tuning arguments point out that in order for there to be a universe anything like ours with stable things at all, with anything interesting whatsoever, the values of the initial conditions had to be within a tiny range, the values of the gravitational constant, blah, blah, blah. All the constants in the fundamental laws had to be finely tuned. And this starts to look like the universe is a setup job in some sense. Now, there's other ways you could explain it. You could say, well, there's this universe generator that generates ones with all different kinds of laws, so it was bound to come up with one like this. Okay, that's an explanation. If you're driven to say that a universe generator that creates a near infinity of universes with different laws and initial conditions, if you're in a position to think that the fine-tuning gives you evidence for that, well, I'll be happy to say, okay, well, you agree it's evidence of something. I have this alternative explanation that also seems pretty good. Now, not everybody accepts these fine-tuning arguments. There's lots to say about them. I can imagine coming to a point where I say, oh, you're right. They kind of fall apart. But they're not trivial. So we could talk more about other kinds of arguments if you like later on. But let's move on to religious experience. So I read the New Testament. The person of Jesus sort of jumps out at me as here's this real person, a real person who's very appealing in lots of ways. I ask myself, did this person really exist? Is this person really God? Maybe I should think about it. I think about it, and I have some very striking experiences. Experiences that I take to be God, that I take to be Jesus in some sense, making himself present. Wow. Now, this isn't just me. I mean, I know it's weird and whatever, but this is like tons and tons of people. And these aren't experiences like necessarily you fall out of your chair or something. They're experiences that Gideon would, describe as, well, he has an invisible friend. And some children have invisible friends for whose existence is sort of palpable to them. And Zimmerman has this kind of glitch, which it turns out lots of adults have in one way or another. And some of them, I don't know, they're not obviously crazy. Pascal has this incredible experience. He's not an idiot, and so on. So it's that sort of thing happens.
Can you tell me what they're like? I mean, I don't want to break protocol here, but
well, so I'm sure they're very different for different people. So different people describe it very differently. So Pascal wrote some kind of poem, and he said, from such and such time to such and such time on such and such date, fire, divine love, stuff like that. So it was just a sense, powerful, and I think this describes some of the kinds of experiences that I've had. A powerful sense that God loves me in a way that's just kind of overwhelming. And, what do you do with that? You have to decide what to do with it. Now, I think I want to kind of move on to the problem of evil in a way, because this is the nature of this experience and the nature of the way I take God to be, the way I take Jesus to be showing us what God is like, obviates to some extent, obviates for me to a huge extent, some of the fiendishness worries that you're describing. Because I agree, if I thought that there was a deity who was extremely powerful, maybe all-powerful, who created this world, and who wanted occasional human sacrifices from us, because this showed that we were sufficiently serious about this being, and that we knew that he was a force to be reckoned with. Okay, I would think that the noble, proper thing to do would be to resist and be fried, if that's the result. The noble thing to do would be to say, I'll have no part of this. Okay. So the thing about Jesus is that Jesus is disturbed and appalled by all of the suffering around him. And in some sense, he's aware that God is responsible for all of this. Nevertheless, it's not the way it's supposed to be. God didn't want it this way. And I actually can do things about it. So he goes around healing people. Right? And he wishes he could heal more people. So the things that we find appalling, apparently God finds them appalling as well. Is God selecting just a few people, saving them, casting everybody else aside. That would be appalling as well. I don't think that's the picture that we get. Now, how to square that with the idea that God is responsible for everything is really tricky. And this is the problem of evil. Now, I don't know whether we want to address the problem of fiendishness exactly or the problem of evil. So I think the problem of fiendishness is how can you sort of wrap your mind around the idea that these people who know God's responsible for, God could have just sent a letter. God didn't have to do any miracles. God could have sent a letter with a little bit of information on it several hundred years ago, and we would have wiped out, I don't know, some significant disease, polio or something. Why didn't God do that? Just a tiny thing would have fixed so much. Any God who didn't do that would be a fiend. And so no matter how loving he claimed to be and how much love a person felt from this being, they should regard it as a fate. Now, I don't. I take it that either there's some reason that I don't understand, or there are some reasons that I vaguely understand. And so we can start talking about those. And they might be the kind of reasons that would make you say, okay, well, I see how Zimmerman can sort of, get his head into this place where it's not fiendishness that's being worshipped any longer. So maybe that's where we should go.
Yeah, sure. Can we just back up for a second?
Yeah.
So, Jesus and God, one and the same, I guess, are disturbed by the suffering they see. And wish they could do more about it? Wish they could do something about it? Is one of them limited in power?
They wish that it wasn't there. But there is some for some reason. And then the question is, so I think the reason there is some is easy to understand. And lots of people very naturally take it on board. The reason why there's some is because if God just created a whole bunch of absolutely perfect automatons, they'd be automatons. Or if he created absolutely perfect beings who could not be tempted to do anything selfish or to harm anyone else or whatever, that this would be fine, maybe. Maybe there's worlds like that. Maybe there's whole universes populated by tons of beings like that, which are perfectly good of their kind, but there's no morality there. There's no freedom, there's no morality. Where there's no freedom, there's no moral virtues, there's no moral vices, and you can't have the one without the other if God, So that the basic free will kind of defense. That, I think, explains at least why there's people trying to do bad things. And I think it explains why there's people who succeed in doing bad things. If they're really in relationships that matter with other people, then they have to be able to harm as well as help those people if they're going to have any kind of interesting interconnectedness. Okay, so that's where some of it comes from. And then the question is, why so much? Why didn't God stop Stalin a little sooner? Why didn't God stop Hitler a little sooner? Why didn't God wipe out this disease a little sooner?
I'm actually not so puzzled by why there is human evil in the world, for the reasons that you gave. A world in which human evil was impossible. Human evil, but that is when one human being wrongfully harms another. If God made that impossible, it's true. It's hard to imagine what life would be like. Though I do sometimes wonder what God had in mind for paradise. Because, at least as the story goes, the initial hope was that Adam and Eve and their progeny would live forever in paradise. And if they had lived forever in paradise, if they hadn't fallen, would they not have had free will? Would they not have... It's a little unclear to me what that was supposed to be like. But that was plan A. Wasn't it?
Yeah.
And so plan A must have been very good. And the fall is
this is
unfortunate.
This is where I think Christians part company. But there is a traditional doctrine called "O Felix Culpa," or at least that's a phrase from a part of the Mass, I guess, or from some. What is that from? "O Felix Culpa." "Oh, happy fall" is what it means. There's a doctrine that says, you know what? Actually, it's a good thing that people sinned, because it brought into being the possibility of all kinds of positive things, virtues that couldn't have been exercised otherwise, the redemptive plan that is marvelous, and so on. But my version of this doctrine goes like this. You can't have creatures that can genuinely, freely choose between good and bad unless they have some inclinations that are selfish. And I take it that, I think we got some of these from our animal ancestors. Right? That if there was a first couple or a first group or something like that was really responsible, really rational, they had these kinds of tendencies. But they had other kinds too, and they could think enough so that they were responsible. And I think that this was good. So it was good that they already have these tendencies. Now this is very controversial. Not everybody's going to buy that, but otherwise I agree with you. It's utterly mysterious how evil could have crept in here if God created two beings who were perfectly good, only wanted good things, loved God perfectly, understood God's will perfectly, understood that God loved them and cared about them, so when he said don't do this, it was serious, he meant it, and it was good for them. If they knew all that stuff, they couldn't do anything but obey. And that might be a good world, but it wouldn't be a world with the kind of relationships that we've got, where we can actually, it matters how I treat my family. It matters how we treat one another. And we can hurt one another in tiny ways and in bigger ways, and likewise help one another. And I think all the human virtues depend on this.
All right, I have a sense of how that story goes, and I'm going to spot you human evil. That is, maybe it's completely consistent with there being a perfect God, that there be human beings who do awful things to one another. That's sort of why, when I was raising the problem, I leaned on suffering from disease, natural evil, as it's sometimes called, because cancer isn't something that human beings do to one another. When children suffer in horrible ways from childhood diseases, that's not the result of any human being exercising his free will in morally valuable ways. That's just a result of nature doing an awful thing to a human being. And so my starting point was that if there were a perfect God, an omnipotent, omniscient God, he could see to it that just didn't happen. Maybe death is inevitable. Maybe human life couldn't be valuable in the ways that it is unless our lives were finite. So maybe it's inevitable that even if there's a perfect God implementing this sort of plan, we will eventually die. But that sort of suffering and that sort of premature death is something that God could stop in a second if he wanted to. And he chooses not to. And forget my question whether it can be morally decent to love a God who does all of that. That is also, from my point of view, extremely good evidence that whatever this thing is that you're catching glimpses of in your moments of religious experience, it's not perfectly good, or maybe not perfectly powerful. I strongly suspect that the experience itself isn't enough to clue you into the nature of this deity. So if that's right, you're going beyond what's given in that experience when you judge that the being revealed is perfect. And now you have excellent evidence from real experience that if that being is omnipotent, he's not perfect.
Yeah, so I grant you that religious experiences don't deliver omnipotence, and they don't deliver omniscience. As a matter of fact, people who have these kinds of experiences in all religion. I mean, even in religions that start out polytheistic, even in Hinduism, which remains polytheistic, there is this force that pulls them towards a single being that knows everything, and a single being that is absolutely in control, made everything. So there is a pull in our, and people who do the cognitive science of religion have these explanations for why it's super powerful, super all-knowing, and so on, why that comes naturally to us. But it does come naturally to us, and we have a religious tradition that asserts that it's true. And this religious tradition is hooked up with the experience that I have. And, I mean, I have to look at it and see whether it looks like it's promoting largely good things or bad things, by my lights. I mean, I have to use my own moral intuitions to some extent. But if it's something that's calling me to be much, much better than I would have thought I had an obligation to be, well, then I'm thinking I have a reason to go with that one, or at least I'm not morally culpable for going with that one. And if that one includes incredible power, knowledge, and so on, then so be it. I take wisdom and nurture from that tradition, and so I take that on board. Now, the question of, I guess I wanted to say a little about the amount and kinds and sort of why so much. I mean, so one possibility is that there has to be something bad in order for us to be able to be worth something to one another. And however much badness there is, we could complain that there should have been less. That's a possibility. And if so, then there'd be bound to be some gratuitous, something that could have been omitted, it would have made things a little better, but you can't blame God for that. Now you're saying it's huge amounts, and huge amounts of natural evil. And here, I guess I want to go two ways. I want to go sort of mystical, and I should expect not to be able to understand some of it. Okay. So the mystical direction is, I'm told Christ suffered horribly, identified with our suffering, and so is saying, I understand how bad it is. This sounds a bit rough. The first time I read this, I thought, yeah. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought it was all right. There's a writer named Charles Williams. He was one of the Inklings. He said, the cross is God taking some of his own medicine. Which I found a little jaw-dropping at first, but the more I've thought about it, the more I thought, no, that's fair enough. So in the interpretation of that event that you get from Paul and from Peter, well, whoever wrote Peter, Peter. The interpretation, one of the interpretations you get is we are somehow identifying with Christ in our sufferings. Somehow what Christ did enables our sufferings to be caught up into something that's worthwhile. So God took this on so that what we experience in the worst of times will, on reflection, be able to be seen as somehow something that allows us insight into God's very nature, or something like that. Okay, this is Marilyn Adams' idea. She kind of spins this out in a certain way. Different mystical types have spun it out in various ways. Okay, that's sort of a glimpse of something. Now, the last time I trotted that out, I was arguing with a grad student, and he pulled out a knife and said, "Here, give me your hand." How you respond to that in a bar at midnight when you gave a 3-hour seminar that was your job talk, and you have a fever of 102. How do you respond to that? I know I should have responded. I should have said, well, I'll just hope for the best. But another thing that I think is a part of my package of ways of understanding this is I should expect there to be a lot of bad stuff that happens in the world for which I can see no good reason and for which I have an obligation to try to do something. So I should expect that there would appear to be lots and lots of places where I can make a difference, and if I don't, things are going to be bad. Maybe they're not bad in the way that I think they are. Maybe they're somehow caught up into this mystical whatever. I can hope that that's true. But I don't know that it's true. And I have an obligation to do something. Now, why should I expect God to make a world like that? Well, because if he didn't, if every little bit of badness or whatever had an obvious good role to play, there'd be no, I wouldn't have any, I see you about to fall off a cliff. Well, yep, I'm sure it'll be fine, right? I know it'll be fine. It's always fine. So I do think I've got reason to suspect if God made a world with these kinds of creatures who have these kinds of moral responsibilities towards one another, I am going to see evil that I think is not doing any good. So I put those two together. I expect that I should see evil that isn't doing any good. And I can hope that God really secretly is doing something about a lot of it. And that's where I put my hopes.
There's a lot to say about that. So that's one possibility.
Yeah.
One possibility is that the religious experience is veridical, the tradition is reliable, the package you just described in which we should expect some suffering, it's good that we be vulnerable to certain kinds of suffering so that we can need one another in ways that make the ties that bind human beings possible. All of that's true. And yet, when someone does suffer in an awful way, a way in which no human being can do anything about, and a way in which God is not doing anything about, when someone does suffer in that way, somehow or other, that's compatible with God's perfect goodness in ways that we can't understand. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that God isn't good. And people can disagree about how they weigh evidence in complicated cases. The cases like that, cases I just described, where someone suffers horribly in a way that no human being can do anything about and that God chooses to do nothing about, they are everywhere, right? They are ubiquitous. And I focused on children because they're
we haven't said anything about animal suffering.
Right, and then,
which is a huge problem.
My sense is even if I had some of these experiences and I don't recognize them in my own experience, and even if I was more immersed in this religious tradition than I actually am, presented with the totality of this evidence, the religious tradition is old stories passed down, modified over many years to serve many purposes. The experiences are vague in their content. Presented with all of that and the manifest suffering that a perfect God is clearly doing nothing about, I think one should have very little confidence, rationally speaking, that there's a perfect being who's nonetheless letting this happen. Maybe there's some kind of supernatural being, but either he's not powerful enough to save the children's lives, or worse, he is powerful enough, he knows exactly how to do it, but he's choosing not to for reasons that we can't understand. So my sense is that if one's going to consider the balance of evidence for the existence of a perfectly good, perfectly powerful God, it comes down pretty heavily against. But that's okay. The evidence here, you might think, is conflicted, hard to assess, and it doesn't have to be conclusive. That is, you might think, the evidence takes me a certain distance. This goes back to one of the definitions of faith that was on the screen. The evidence takes me a certain distance, and after that, it really is a matter of hope or trust or faith, which leads me to believe something that goes well beyond what the evidence can support, but something that it's morally good for me to do that, and I'm more rationally entitled to do that. Is that a line you'd want to take?
It's a line I would want to... So I think most Christians are in a wide range. So most Christians over their life, most religious people over their life, are in a lot of different, what we would call epistemic states. In other words, they have different amounts and kinds of evidence one way or another for their belief. So at some times, a person might, so if God appears to you in a pillar of fire or something like that, well, and says, I got a reason for everything I do, and convinces you that he's good. Well, then, boy, you're in a pretty good position to say that there's at least a supernatural being, and to really hope that it's as good as it claims to be. Okay, that doesn't happen very often. Okay, I admit, I have not had the pillar of fire. But nevertheless, there are religious experiences that people have that are sufficiently powerful that it's like a hallucination, as if a truck is coming towards you, if it's not true. And you're not to be blamed for believing that, you're not blamed for being ready to jump out of the way if you have a very powerful hallucination of a truck coming at you. And you're not to be blamed if you come to belief in those sort of circumstances. But in calm reflection, you might decide there wasn't a truck there. In calm reflection, you may come, because of the kinds of issues you're raising, to have doubts about the veridicality of this experience. Was it real? And I think that Christians often are, I have been at various times, in a position where what I've got is a kind of faith that goes beyond the evidence. So, where I still believe, but I see all kinds of reason to doubt, and I have to admit, okay, I don't here have the kind of justification that raises something up to the level of knowledge. I'm not really bothered by that, because I think we can often get in a circumstance where we have reason to doubt that something's true, but we have an obligation, a moral obligation, to continue to believe it, or at least to try to believe it, and at least to act like it's true. So, for example, there's really nice arguments from naturalistic evolution to anti-realism about ethics. That is, moral obligations. All of our talk about morality is, at best, it's relative, or I don't know. You give some kind of spin on it. So Sharon Street has this nice article, which I think is pretty powerful. If there are these absolute moral truths that don't depend upon human beings' opinions, and I think that there are, and most everybody thinks that there are, most of the time. Yeah. So if there are, how is it that our faculties are tracking those truths at all reliably? And when you look at sort of our evaluative tendencies, if they just come from blind evolutionary forces, their general thrust is, what's it going to be? It's going to be in directions that, keep our genes in the gene pool. And how and why should we think that these inclinations, all tidied up, are tracking objective moral truth? I think people who see that argument don't believe in any kind of designer who's sort of making sure that we're tracking truth. Those people have an obligation to say, there's something wrong with that argument, though I don't know what it is. And I think they're doing the right thing when they say that. And plenty of people do that. Plenty of ethicists today do that. I think they're doing the right thing, but they don't see quite what's wrong with the argument. Now, I think that requires some faith on their part, and I think it's right and proper that they exercise it. So And I think faith comes up in a lot of, my spouse is on vacation and has been away for a long time, and I hear that there was a shipwreck, and there was something wrong with that. The wife in The Walking Dead who just like that, all of a sudden she's with that other guy, right? That was wrong. Everybody agree?
So the hardest, I don't know how we're doing on time, but
I think we have probably another 10, 15 minutes for this part of the discussion. I'll let you finish your thought, but I would like to suggest that at some point, we've heard a lot from Dean actually about defending his position, and perhaps at some point, Dean, if you wanted to
I've been hogging the microphone.
Okay. Well, another way to put it is if you could pose a question to that you would like Gideon to answer and allow him to expand on defend his views a little bit, I think that might be helpful too.
Okay, let me just finish my thought, and then we'll give that a try. So the hardest question for me, raised by the issues we've been discussing, is when it is morally and rationally okay to believe beyond the evidence. Because, in part for the reasons that Dean was getting at, I think it's got to be okay, often, to believe things that you can't defend by argument, to believe things even though you know that there are what look like pretty good arguments that you can't undermine against them. So moral principles are like that for me. I'm quite sure that it's morally wrong to cause pain for fun. But if you actually ask me to prove that, to defend it against some kind of skeptical argument, I'm not exactly sure I know where to start. And most of my moral convictions, which are as robust as anyone's religious convictions, are like that. So I think it's got to be okay sometimes to believe things that you can't prove. But I also think it can't always be okay to believe things you can't prove. So here's an analogy. Suppose there was a guy, a human being, who, when you met him, he just filled you with confidence that he was good. He exudes goodness. He does many good things. You see him doing some conspicuously good things. So you have lots of evidence. And maybe there's a long tradition. Everybody says he's a good guy. People have been talking about this guy for ages, and all of them say, you should trust him. He loves you, and he's got your best interests at heart, and he's not omnipotent, but he does lots of excellent things. On the other hand, you know that this guy beats his dog brutally. You know that this guy neglects his children. He's got children who are sick, whom he could easily help, and he just lets them suffer and goes off and does other things. Maybe he beats his wife. And you know that too. But you've got this evidence that he's very good. He fills you with confidence that he's good whenever you see him. Is it morally permissible to trust this guy? To trust that he is good? To trust that there's some way in which all of the awful things he does must somehow make sense? That they must be, you're not smart enough to see it, but somehow it's all for the best? I don't think so. It seems to me that the right attitude to take in that sort of case is, I don't know why this guy does what he does, but he's not telling me. So as far as I can tell, he's a bastard who often acts nicely, and and the impression he gives is misleading. He's a charming bastard. And now I'm not saying the God case is exactly like that, because this inference that I make from the many things this guy does to that description of him depends on my knowing something about what human beings are like and the kinds of things that human beings tend to do. I know that human beings can be charming but deceitful, charming but malicious, and so on. So I've got this guy pegged as one of those. Although my evidence is consistent with there being some kind of reason for his awful behavior, it would be crazy under these circumstances for me to trust that somehow or other he really is as good as he seems to be. So there are disanalogies between that case and the case of God. But I must say that, just given my sense of what the evidence on the good side is like, if you could assure me, maybe the sky opens up and I become persuaded that there is a supernatural being who's making all of this happen, or at least is monkeying with it as it happens and is responsible for the existence of the universe. If I just knew that there was a supernatural being who did all this, I would suspend judgment about whether he was good. In fact, I would be inclined to suspect that either he can't do anything about the suffering around here or he's a bastard. And I have a question about whether any other attitude in that sort of case could possibly be the good kind of faith, the kind of faith that goes beyond the evidence in ways that are consistent with our moral obligations to take the evil people do seriously.
So the analogy is very, very useful and very scary and telling, I think, in a way. My thoughts about it are, sort of on the fly, that here we've got a being who has to create an independent world where things work in ways that where it's not obvious that God's there. I think there's good reason to think that God doesn't want to be completely obvious to everybody all the time. That this would be actually a bad thing. At least if we knew that God was perfectly good and was perfectly just and was going to right every wrong, and we also knew what was right and wrong, and God was sort of in our face all the time, well, then the freedom would go out the window. So there's got to be some kind of mystery here about God's presence, or we got to be able to put it out of our minds at least. So God has to make a world that isn't obviously just run by miracle all the time. Now, a being who makes a sort of independent world is very different from a father of a family. I think has different responsibilities towards them and has different powers. So the father and the mother can't assure that their children, that something bad that happens to their children now will serve some good purpose later in their life. Can't know that. They can't know that. This God could know that. And if life is much bigger than it looks like it is, so if life goes far beyond this little span, well, then there's a whole bunch of it that we don't know what it's like. And so this God can take care of things there. Now, if the taking care of things there is merely outweighing bad stuff here, more good stuff there to outweigh it, I don't like that. I don't like that. So I think there has to be a need for this kind of badness in order for it to be allowed. Okay. What exactly that is, I don't know. But I would hope that it is. I would hope that it is epistemically okay, or that I'm in the clear in some sense, that it's all right for me to hope that the right analogy is something like this. You've got this person who you've known them for a long time. You've seen them do lots of good things. Other people say that they're really good. And you witness, every time you walk by their house, you see their son being spanked or something like that. Maybe spanking is one can no longer do that. Okay, being shouted at, all right, or something like that. Very severely.
Being reasoned with.
Severely reasoned with severely. Every single time, that's what you see, and you reach the conclusion. I guess this guy isn't such a great guy after all. Well, I think I should give the guy the benefit of the doubt. Now, I'd have to have a lot of reason. The more times I saw that, I would have to think that these are really unrepresentative, and I would have to think that there is some kind of good this serves. So that's where that's what I'm hoping for.
All right, so should I say? I mean,
Yeah.
so far I've been playing along in a way that is taking much more seriously than I actually do.
And I appreciate that.
The idea that there might be a being like this. We should talk about whether there's, apart from religious experience, which I don't have any of, what kind of evidence we've got for the existence of invisible beings who make and run the world. These would be things that don't show up in the lab when we do our experiments. These are things that don't figure in sort of ordinary, detailed, testable scientific theories about why the world is the way it is. So we've got lots of evidence for things from the distant past on the strength of elaborate accounts of how the rivers were formed and how the mountains were formed and things like that. So even though we don't test those in the laboratory by making mountains or by allowing the rivers to form, all of that takes too long. Nonetheless, we have abundant evidence for the theories in geology and evolutionary biology that tell us how things were in the past. We don't have that kind of evidence, scientific evidence, for the existence of an invisible person who made the world. We might have something sort of analogous to scientific evidence, but it wouldn't pass muster in a science journal because the hypothesis doesn't generate testable predictions, isn't part of a worked-out theory in conjunction with which it yields testable predictions and so on. So it's not science. So the evidence we have for the existence of God isn't scientific evidence. We did talk a little bit about philosophical arguments for the existence of God, which have something in common with scientific arguments. So there's an argument that says every contingent thing that happens or every contingent thing that exists has a cause. There can't be some kind of infinite regress of causes that would take those causes backwards forever in time or something like that. Therefore, there must be a necessary being whose existence somehow explains all of the contingent facts and all of the contingent beings. And as Dean put it, the principle that drives this argument, for every contingent thing that happens, there must be some sufficient cause for its occurrence, is a very, very strong principle. My own view is that we have no particular reason to believe it. Sometimes things have causes, sometimes they don't. It's amazing that as many things have causes as do. It's amazing that we're as good at explaining things as we are, but if we find things in physics or somewhere else that don't admit of explanation, I wouldn't wheel out a philosophical principle to say, there must be something invisible, something otherwise unknown to science that explains that explains why the uranium atom decayed exactly when it did. That's the kind of thing that might have no cause at all. And anyway, there's something paradoxical about this principle, right? We have a contingent thing. So this bottle is here rather than here. That's a contingent fact. Somehow the existence of a necessary being is supposed to explain that contingent fact. Well, how does it do it? Presumably because God made some choices. God's choices are contingent facts that explain why the world is this way rather than that way. But God's choosing to create a world of this kind, that's a contingent fact. What explains it? God's existence. That doesn't explain why God made this choice rather than that choice. So either there's no contingency at all, or there's some contingency that can't be explained. And so the principle that says there are contingent facts and every single one of them needs an explanation, therefore God exists, is a principle that we have reasons internal to this kind of theology to reject. So that's that was very quick and probably completely unintelligible. But when the philosophical argument...
I do accept everything you said.
When the philosophical arguments for the existence of God are wheeled out...
I'll vouch for it.
My experience is that they always involve some very strong methodological premise, or premise about some factual premise maybe, that isn't required for science, that we don't have any independent ground for believing, that it's easy to deny, and which has been inserted into the argument, at least in its modern form, just to get the conclusion that God exists. So I find these philosophical arguments for the existence of God pretty systematically unpersuasive for that reason.
Fine-tuning?
Fine-tuning. So one sometimes reads that if the constants that figured in the basic laws of nature were slightly different, then after the Big Bang, the universe would have been so hot that atoms would never have formed. And if atoms never form, stars never form, and if stars never form, planets never form, and if planets never form, living things never emerge, and if living things never emerge, conscious life never emerges. So if the fundamental constants had been ever so slightly different, life as we know it wouldn't exist. And that gives the impression that the fundamental laws of nature have been fine-tuned so as to permit the existence of living things, or complex matter, or whatever you think it is. I run this by physicists every now and then, cosmologists who actually know something about how the laws of nature look. I have never met one who finds it even remotely plausible. And what they all say to me is, we don't know what the fundamental laws of nature are. So it's way premature to start claiming that the constants that figure in the fundamental laws of nature are finely tuned in this way. We have some pretty deep theories, but we know they're wrong. We know they're wrong because they're incompatible with one another. So we have a theory of gravitation, we have a theory of particle physics, and they can't both be right because they're inconsistent with one another. So their view is, wait and see. So at least it's not a completely random sample, but my experts say, at this stage, none of this counts as evidence for anything extravagant because the central claim, the claim that the constants in the fundamental inexplicable laws have been fine-tuned in this way, isn't part of science.
Not yet.
Not yet. So suppose it were. Suppose they work it all out tomorrow and there's a headline in the New York Times that says, fundamental theory of everything finally developed. The theory has 3 constants in it, a gravitational constant, constants for some of the other forces and so on. And it turns out that if any of those had differed by as much as 0.01%, matter would never have existed. Now, there are speculations in physics that would take the edge off this sort of argument. So note what we're asking. We're not now asking whether there is evidence for the existence of God. We're asking whether there could be scientific evidence for the existence of God. And even internal to science, one possibility is that this is an absolutely brute fact that just can't be explained. It's weird, but it can't be explained. Another possibility is that the fact is to be explained by the existence of a supernatural being who chose the laws to be this way. And another possibility is that there's some physical process that spits out every possible menu of fundamental laws. So if you're spitting out every possible universe, one of them is going to be like this. Many of them will be universes where life is impossible. Some of them will be universes where life is possible. Now, it so happens that contemporary physics tends to be generating theories that have something like that character completely inadvertently. So it's not as if the physicists want there to be many universes. It just so happens that when you start giving theories of how the expansion of the universe has been playing out over the years, you find yourself generating these suckers. It's sort of an embarrassment. They don't want there to be millions, billions, maybe infinitely many universes that we can't get to from here, that we can't get any information from, that nonetheless somehow exist. But another possibility consistent with the fine-tuning facts is what's sometimes called the multiverse, that there are many, many possible universes, this being only one of them. I think the right thing to say at this stage is we have no idea. The right thing to say when we get the fine-tuning facts, if we do get them, is that, again, we have no idea. It's possible this is a brute fact. It's possible that it's the result of this multiverse process. Maybe it's possible that an invisible being is doing is creating the laws of nature. I find it hard to imagine myself vividly in that epistemic situation, I can certainly imagine getting scientific evidence for the existence of God. Right? If the stars in the sky started spelling out God exists.
The electron microscope reveals made by God.
Yeah, that's right.
Brought to you by...
So I'm not...
Who brought you water and air?
It's funny, I was doing something... I haven't done many things like this, but I was doing one at Princeton, and I brought my 13-year-old son along, and I was making this concession. I was saying, I could imagine being persuaded by the scientific evidence that God exists, and I gave a story like that. And my son, who hadn't said anything, was just playing with his Game Boy the whole time, looked up and said, "That's not what you'd say." I said, "What?" He said, "No, you'd say it was aliens." And he's absolutely right. That is, you'd fish around for something wild, but less wild than the existence of an absolutely powerful, immaterial spiritual being. You'd think something really funny was going on, but you might not think it was God. Anyway, be that as it may, we are now off in super speculative territory. Some people have objected to theism on the grounds that it is, by its very formulation, unscientific. That's not my line. I don't think it is by its very formulation unscientific. I just think that the evidence for it now is just lousy. That is much worse than the evidence we have for theories that we dismiss all over the place. There's probably more evidence for the existence of ghosts than for the existence of God.
I'm not going to go down the ghost
Okay.
route, but can I say one thing?
Yeah, sure, let me just,
Yeah.
if there's like 2 minutes each, if you want something you want to say at the very last thing.
I retract the ghost thing. That's probably not true.
I was going to actually go along with that.
There's a lot of testimony.
Not more.
Maybe even some photographs.
More evidence.
Okay.
I don't. I guess I don't believe in ghosts. But the fact that I'm not sure whether I believe in ghosts, that probably tells you something. Let's see. What do I want to say here? So lots and lots of people. I see fine-tuning and cosmological arguments as attempts to make precise a kind of reaction to the contingency and the complexity of the world. So people, scientists, most of the scientists who've contributed anything really original and significant have looked at the world and they've said, this looks like there's somebody behind this. And of course, if something made everything else, then you're not going to see it under a microscope. It's not that small. You're not going to see it over there. I mean, it's calling it an invisible being is accurate. It's a bit unfair. So if there were such a being, then of course it would be invisible in the sense that it wouldn't be one of the things that you can see with your eyes. Okay. So lots and lots of people look at the world, all the big scientists. And Boyle, Newton, Leibniz, Pascal, Faraday, Babbage, Maxwell, Pasteur, Kelvin, Cantor, Max Planck, Heisenberg, all these guys looked at it and said, I know there's all this evil. And of course they knew about the evil as well as we do. And they said, this looks to me like the kind of thing that was, of course they were raised in homes where they were taught that there is such a being. And you were raised in a home where you were taught that there weren't. Most scientists today were raised in homes, it turns out, at least most scientists who teach at research universities, a vast majority of them were raised in homes where religion didn't exist. Wishful thinking cuts both ways. I mean, Thomas Nagel says he doesn't believe in God because he hopes there's no such being. So there's reasons to hope that there's no such being that I understand and that are sort of noble in a way. If you think if there were such a being, he would be a fiend. All right, okay, fair enough. But if it's just because that would be really inconvenient, that would sort of mess up my whole. That would mess up my whole week. That's not such a good reason.
Okay, I think we're at the point where we want to take questions from the audience, but first Matt's going to come up and say a few things.
Yeah, first of all, let's just thank our professors for sharing their thoughts.
I don't deserve the last word.
Thank you, gentlemen. Before we transition into a short Q&A, I just want to stress that we are reading your cards, but due to time, we can't get to obviously all of you. There's so many of you. So what I want to say is we picked a couple to address now, but after we have this Q&A, I want to encourage you guys to bring up the questions that we couldn't get to with the people at your tables or people around you, for those of you in the back. It's not that we don't value your questions or don't think that they're good, it's just that we want to respect your time. So we picked a couple questions to give to our professors, and then after Jerry has posed those questions, we're going to move into a time of discussion among all of you.
Okay, so I guess to give Gideon maybe the last word, I'll ask the question to Dean first. So the question for you, Dean, is does final judgment speak at all to the assertion that God is a bastard?
Final judgment, the righting of wrongs, the sort of weighing everything that everyone has done in the balance and vindicating the people who did the right thing and condemning the people who did the wrong thing. We think of talk of the final judgment or assize as this big problem for theism, or for Christianity in particular, or any of the three major Western monotheisms. They all believe in it, because we're thinking that there's this unfair, mean judge who, on the basis of slender reasons, is going to throw a whole bunch of people into hell forever. Okay, if that's the picture, and especially if it involves throwing into hell forever, all these ancestors of ours who didn't know anything, on the basis of their not having it, of course, if they'd heard the name of Christ, they would have, then it would have been fine. But so I can't abide that. I'm sorry, and I know that there's Christians who stomach that. But it's got to be more complicated than that. Most people, most times and places, when they hear that there's going to be a final judgment, they rightly go, hooray! Because they've been stomped on and they've been injured badly. We're pretty fortunate. We're living in a fairly stable society. But even here, where we're pretty lucky, people do, set bombs at the ends of races and things like that. And when you're subjected to a lot of that, and you hear somebody's going to right these wrongs somehow, that's good news. Now, I do think that if on the basis of a tiny little life and few choices, God is going to let that set the trajectory of your destiny forever, and you're going to, be in eternal torment forever, something like that. But he freely gives out all this forgiveness to other people who are much worse. I think that's not right. I don't think the final judgment's going to be like that. Not exactly what it's going to be like, I don't know. We've got a book, it's got a whole bunch of stuff in it, and it's really mysterious, and there's horses, and there's locusts, and there's stuff that burns your flesh, and all kinds of stuff. So there's something wild that's going to go on, but I think it's going to be just and fair.
So it's going to be okay for people like me.
Yes, Gideon. God's not done with you. That's what I said.
Okay, thank you, Dean. We have a question for Gideon as well. And the question is, can Dr. Rosen give an account of where moral truth comes from? I think maybe what they're getting at is this idea that you said words like appalling or fiendish, and where do you feel that sense comes from in And it's not, exclusive to you. I think many people feel that way about things going on in the world.
All right, so there are several versions of this question. It's one thing to ask, where do our moral opinions come from, our moral beliefs? That's a question about how we come to hold certain attitudes or opinions or views. And it's, in my view, an extremely complicated biological and psychological question. So, but then I'll talk a little bit about that. But then there's also the question, where do the moral facts themselves come from? So when people ask where do the moral truths come from, they might not be asking a question about our moral opinions. They might be asking, what makes it the case that it's wrong to cause pain for fun? What makes it the case that it's wrong to break a promise without a very good reason? What makes it the case that parents are morally obliged to take care of their children? And so on. Where do the moral facts come from, not our opinions about them? So those are two totally different questions. On the second question, where do the moral facts come from? Well, some of them come from others. So maybe the fact that it's wrong to break a promise comes from the fact that the practice of promise breaking is socially valuable, and it is wrong to take advantage of a socially valuable practice for one's own benefit when others are bearing the costs of that practice. So that's a standard argument that one sometimes hears for why it's wrong to break a promise. You benefit all the time from the fact that other people keep their promises. When you break a promise, you're a free rider, taking advantage of this practice of trust for your own benefit while being unwilling to bear the costs of that practice. So that is a little bit of philosophy that explains one moral fact, you ought to keep your promises, in terms of another. You shouldn't be a free rider. But it doesn't explain where that first moral fact comes from. You shouldn't be a free rider. My own view is that when we give explanations in ethics, we explain why this is wrong by saying it's a special case of that, and that's wrong. We ask why that's wrong. We say, it's a special case of something else, and that's wrong. Eventually, these explanations have to run out. And I don't know where they run out. This is an open question in moral philosophy. Eventually, we'll get to some first principles of ethics, some ethical principles that can't be explained in that way by deriving them from other ethical principles. And my view is that those first principles of ethics don't come from anywhere. They are basic facts, like the axioms of mathematics, or like the fundamental laws of nature. There are some facts which can't be explained. And fundamental facts in every area, by definition, cannot be explained. The basic laws of nature can't be explained, in my view. Otherwise, they wouldn't be basic. The basic principles of mathematics can't be explained. Otherwise, they wouldn't be basic. And the same goes for the basic principles of ethics. So I think ethics has the same structure as every other domain of knowledge. There are going to be some facts we, in the end, can't explain. They may be so obvious to us when we see them that we think, all right, maybe that's a legitimate starting point. Or maybe not. Who knows? We don't know what they look like yet. Where do our moral opinions come from? Some people think that our moral opinions, our moral views, are like our factual views. So I believe that there's a pen in front of me. Why? Because there is a pen in front of me, and I've got eyes which are responsive to what's going on in front of them. So through a process which we begin to understand but don't have a fully worked out account of, my belief that there's a pen in front of me is caused by the fact that there's a pen in front of me. I am responsive to the facts. That's where my beliefs about ordinary objects come from. It's not where all of my beliefs about ordinary objects come from. For example, I have beliefs about the future. I believe that the sun will rise tomorrow. That belief about the future isn't caused by tomorrow. It's not like there's backwards causation where tomorrow reaches back into today and causes me to believe things. No, it's more complicated there. My belief that the sun will rise tomorrow comes from experience together with some inference. And you take Philosophy 101, you get a long story about how that inference might go. Moral beliefs aren't like that. In my opinion, they are not caused by the facts that make them true. I don't believe that it's wrong to cause pain because somehow I've got a moral eye that, when I put it in front of the fact that it's wrong to cause pain, responds and produces in me the belief that it's wrong to cause pain. I don't think it's like that. I think it is, in this respect, more like mathematical belief. It's in lots of respects different from mathematical belief. But whatever it is, my mathematical beliefs are not caused by the numbers. I believe that 2 + 2 is 4. That's not because the number 2 has somehow beamed itself into my brain. It's more complicated than that and different from that. So I don't have a completely worked out story of where, in fact, our moral opinions come from, but I don't think they come from interacting with the moral facts. The moral facts are real. We, when all goes well, can know, for example, that normally you want to keep your promises. We know these things, but the model is not perception. It's not like that. It's more like mathematics.
Thank you. Those were very interesting questions and thoughtful responses to both of them. One final question for both of you, and I guess I'll pose it to Dean first, but the same question to you, Gideon, is it's in some sense a two-part question, but maybe the way that I would ask it is, have you ever seriously considered changing your opinion? And the second part of that question is, what would it take to make you change your opinion concerning, I guess, faith and reason? I'll start with that, Dean.
Was it, have I ever? And what would it take? Those are
Have you
the
ever
two?
seriously considered it?
Yeah. I remember one of my students at Notre Dame, Trenton Merricks, who's a pretty well-known metaphysician. He reported to me once he had this kind of dizzying experience where he suddenly saw how a purely naturalistic picture of the world could make sense to somebody. And it just sort of hadn't happened to him before. And he found it sort of dizzying. But he pulled back. He pulled back from it. And I guess I have to say that I never have felt like, all right, this is it. I'm on the verge of changing my mind about this. And I think part of this is, different people have very different kinds of religious experience. And those of us who kind of have a sort of background sense of God's being there all the time, it's hard for us to kind of get ourselves in the frame of mind where this is a live option. And I guess I would have to say that's probably true of me. Now, what would make me do that? I hope that it wouldn't be something bad happens to me. Something bad happens to me or to my family, something that I know happens to people all the time. I would see that as a major failing in myself. Because I know that happens. I know that people, get hit by cars when they're young and die. If that happening to me was enough to make me, sort of just throw it over, well then I wasn't sufficiently taking that fact seriously beforehand. Now maybe you would say you didn't really fully absorb it, and maybe that's right. But my gut feeling is that would be a failure on my part, because I should right now fully take on board just how bad things are for lots and lots of people. So, I guess that means no and nothing. Oh dear, I'm a little worried about that now.
I agree. No and nothing. I started off by saying that God, as traditionally conceived, is for me just like the gods of Olympus, which is just a way of saying it is not a live option for me. Just as the gods of Olympus, I assume, aren't a live option for anyone in this room. People believe in these things. You can understand it. You can even, in some intellectual way, imagine getting evidence for it. But you're just so sure that was all just an old story that to seriously imagine making that transition is sort of to imagine losing your mind. And I know people do sometimes lose their minds, and I know how it feels to come sort of close to losing your mind. When you're desperately upset about something, I know what it's like to hope that God exists. because I know what it's like to do this sort of, God, if you exist, please help me sort of thing. And I can imagine succumbing in desperation to what I was calling wishful thinking before, and coming to believe that somehow this awful thing that's happening will be okay. So I can imagine losing my mind in that way, but I don't think I've ever come very close, and I hope I don't. So isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting that citizens of the modern world who are acculturated in very similar ways, we know the same things, we have the same kinds of training, we have the same kinds of job, we have the same kinds of friends, could be so different in their sense of what's a serious possibility for the way the world might be. And I'm sure we shouldn't be so surprised it's always been thus, but on this particular issue, it still continues to amaze me that we can differ so radically in our sense of plausibility, given everything else we have in common.
Well, I'd like to thank Gideon and Dean for, I think, a very thoughtful and very honest discussion. I think we should thank them for their time.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.